The high desert of New Mexico territory never cared what you thought of it. A gunshot rang out in a dark alley, 3 blocks from the land office. Then silence. A man fell to the red dirt, and not one soul in the town's 41 buildings stepped out to look, the official report read. Killed by persons unknown, but there were men who knew exactly. The sky over the town was the color of an old wound. Not red, not orange. Something with no clean name in any language spoken beneath it. Wind twisted the juniper trees. The soil bled red, as if the earth were leaking slowly from somewhere deep underneath, from a wound so old it had stopped hurting. At the end of the longest street, where the road turned to dirt, and the dirt turned to nothing, there stood a low house of stone, with a garden that should not have survived in that soil. They called the woman inside it the drum woman, never to her face, because when she passed, people found reasons to look elsewhere. 3 years went by, she stayed. And this morning, at the western rim of the valley, 3 riders came over the rise. She had been waiting for them. September 1883, the high desert of New Mexico territory did not care about your opinion of it, not even a little. It did not soften itself for newcomers, did not apologize for the heat, or the cold that came after the heat, or the wind that came after the cold, or the silence that came after everything else. It simply was. Flat-top messes the color of dried blood. Juniper trees twisted by decades of argument with the wind. Soil so red, it looked like the earth was bleeding slowly from somewhere deep underneath, from some wound so old it had stopped hurting and just kept going. The sky over Harlan's Crossing was the color of an old wound, too. Not red, not orange. Something between the two, something that had no clean name in any language spoken by the people who lived beneath it. A sky that had seen too much, and given up trying to look innocent about any of it. Harlan's Crossing sat at the edge of Colfax County like a man who had wandered too far from home and forgotten which direction he came from. 41 buildings, maybe fewer, depending on which week you counted and who had given up and left the week before. 3 streets with names nobody used. A saloon called the Copper Nail that served warm beer and colder company. A general store run by a man named Orville Speck, who weighed every transaction twice and never looked you in the eye when he told all you the price. A livery stable that smelled of old hay and older grief. A church with a broken bell that had not rung in 2 years, since the Reverend left and nobody saw fit to replace him. And at the far end of the longest street, past where the road turned to dirt and the dirt turned to nothing, there was a house, stone walls, low roof, a garden that should not have survived in that soil but did anyway, out of what seemed like sheer stubbornness, tomatoes, squash, a row of dried peppers hanging from a cord, strung between 2 posts, red as the sky above them. The kind of house that did not ask for your attention, but got it anyway, because of the woman who lived inside it. The people of Harlan's Crossing called her the drum woman. Not to her face, never to her face, but when she walked through town twice a week, sometimes 3 times, when she moved through the narrow gap between the general store and the post office, when she stopped to examine the quality of a bolt of cloth or set a coin on the counter for a sack of cornmeal, people found reasons to look elsewhere, to study the grain of the wood on the counter, to become very interested in a spot on the wall that had been there for years. They were not afraid of her. Not exactly something closer to the feeling you get standing at the edge of a canyon. You are not in danger. The ground beneath your feet is solid, but something in your body knows the drop is there, and it does not let you forget it. Her name was Nora Drum, 62 years old, born in the hill country of Appalachia in a year when Andrew Jackson was still president and the West was still a rumor. She had a face that had been through weather, not worn down by it, shaped by it, the way stone is shaped by water, slowly, over decades, into something that looks like it was always that way. Features that were not soft and had not been soft for a long time. Eyes that were the particular shade of gray that belongs to winter skies and old iron, and things that have endured past their expected end. Not a large woman, medium height. Lean in the way of people who eat what they need and not a bite more. Hands that were brown from sun and strong from decades of work that did not come with a name or a wage or any particular acknowledgement from the world. She walked like someone who had spent years covering ground. Not fast, not slow. A pace that ate distance without making a fuss about it. The walk of a woman who knew exactly how far she had to go had calculated it already, and was simply executing the calculation. 3 years ago they had buried her husband, Deputy U.S. Marshal Callum Drum, 49 years old, shot in an alley 3 blocks from the Colfax County Land Office on a Tuesday evening in October of 1880. The official report said, killed by persons unknown while in performance of his duties. No arrests made, no investigations sustained. The territory had other things to worry about. Billy the Kid was still drawing breath down in Lincoln County. The Maxwell Land Grant Company was still suing settlers off land their families had worked for 20 years. The Santa Fe Ring was still doing whatever the Santa Fe Ring did, which was everything it wanted to everyone who got in its way. One dead deputy marshal in a small town at the western edge of Colfax County was not a headline nor a drum stayed. That was the part that confused people. That was the thing that made them look at the grain of the wood on the counter when she came in. She had no children here, no kin within 500 miles, no particular attachment to the red dust and the hot wind and the 41 buildings of Harlan's Crossing. She could have left. She should have left. Any reasonable woman would have packed what she owned and gone back to wherever she came from and tried to build something new. She stayed. And started a garden. And mended her own roof when the winter cracked the mortar. And traded work for what she needed and asked for nothing she didn't earn. And walked through town twice a week with that distance-eating pace. And people felt the canyon edge when she passed. Because here is what people sensed, even if they could not have put words to it. She was not staying because she had nowhere to go. She was staying because she was not finished yet. On the morning of September 14th, 1883, Nora Drum was standing on her front porch, not sitting, standing and measuring, not with any instrument, with her feet. She took a step from the front door to the edge of the porch, counted it, took another step down to the first patch of packed dirt, counted that, then from there to the gatepost, then from the gatepost to the road. Her lips moved slightly as she counted, not in any agitated way, not the lips of a woman talking to herself out of loneliness or distress, the lips of someone doing arithmetic. Checking a figure she had already calculated, making sure the number was still the same as when she had checked it the week before, and the week before that. She was wearing her working clothes, brown wool dress, faded to a color that had no particular name. A canvas apron with 2 deep pockets, the left one slightly heavier than the right. A pair of boots that had been resoled twice and had miles left in them yet. Her gray hair was pulled back and secured with a single pin. She had not bothered with anything else. There was no one to bother for. When she had finished her measurement, she took a small notebook from her apron pocket, leather-covered, worn at the corners, the kind that cost 15 cents at any general store and lasted years if you treated it right. She made a note, closed it, put it back. Then she looked west. Not in the way people look when they are admiring a view. She looked the way a general looks at a field before a battle, taking in the angles, the distances, the places where a man on horseback would be visible first, coming down from the western rim. The places where the morning glare off the red rock would make it harder to see and easier to be surprised. She stood like that for 4 minutes. Then she went inside and started her coffee. Inside, the house was exactly what it was and nothing more. Stone walls, 2 feet thick, the kind that kept the heat out in summer and the cold in check in winter. A single main room with a fireplace at the north end and a kitchen corner at the south. A table with 4 chairs, though only one of those chairs had been used with any regularity in 3 years. A shelf of books, not decorative books, not books purchased to look educated, but books with broken spines and dog-eared pages and the occasional marginal note in small, precise handwriting. Survey maps of Colfax County pinned to the wall, older ones from before the territory redrew the lines in 1879. A sleeping room beyond a curtained doorway. On the table, a tin cup, a coffee pot, and a notebook, different from the one in her apron pocket. This one was older, the binding repaired with cord, carefully, so the pages stayed together. She did not open it in the mornings. She simply let it sit there while she drank her coffee. The way you let a letter sit on the table after you have already read it 300 times and know every word by heart but still want it near. On the inside cover of that notebook, in a hand that was not hers. Larger, less precise, the handwriting of a man who spent his days in the saddle rather than at a desk. was written a single sentence. When the time is right, you will know. You always knew the terrain better than me. She drank her coffee. She looked at the notebook. She did not open it. At 20 minutes past 10 in the morning, 3 riders appeared at the western rim of the valley. Nora was at the kitchen window when they came over the rise. She had not gone to the window to look for them. She was already there, washing her breakfast dishes, when the movement at the edge of the landscape caught her eye, the way movement always catches the eye of someone who has spent years reading terrain for threat. 3 horses, dark coats. Not local stock, too well-fed, too evenly matched. Horses purchased with intention, not raised from foals. Ridden by people who chose their equipment deliberately. She watched them come down the slope, she noted. The rider on the left sat slightly forward in the saddle, the way men do when they have ridden too many miles in too short a time, and their lower back is lodging formal complaints. The rider in the middle sat perfectly straight, the kind of straight that is not comfort, it is performance. Saying something with his spine without using words. The rider on the right carried his right hand low, close to his thigh, not touching anything, but positioned within half a second of needing to. She watched them come across the flat ground toward the edge of town. She dried her hands on her apron. She took the small notebook from her pocket, opened it to the current page, where a column of dates was written down the left margin in her small, precise hand. The last entry was 11 days ago. Below it she wrote, September 14, morning, 3 riders, west approach. On time, she underlined the last 2 words, twice. Then she put the notebook back in her pocket and said, quietly, to no one, to the empty kitchen, to the morning light coming through the window at its low September angle. A single sentence, there you are, not frightened, not relieved. The voice of a woman who had set a trap 2 weeks ago and had just heard it spring. She did not go to the window again. She did not need to. She knew what was happening out on the main street. She could reconstruct it without seeing any of it. The 3 riders coming in slow, the way strangers always came in slow, when they wanted to be read as not at while being very much one. Orville Speck at the general store stepping back from his doorway. The 2 men who always sat outside the Copper Nail in the mornings, picking up their chairs and carrying them inside without being asked. Heads turning, eyes following, then looking away when the riders looked back. She had seen that sequence before, 8 years earlier, in the mountain passes above Raton, when she was still working as a guide, and a rider came through the north end of a camp with the particular stillness of someone doing reconnaissance. She had seen it again 5 years after that, in a town she no longer named in her thoughts, when men came to buy supplies and what they were really buying was information. Who was here? How many? Where they slept? How fast they could move if things went wrong. She knew the grammar of arrival. And these 3 were saying a very specific sentence, with their bodies and their horses and their careful pace down the main street of Harlan's Crossing. The sentence was, we are looking for something, and we will be polite about it until we are not. She put water on for a second pot of coffee, because if there was one thing she had learned in 62 years on this earth, and she had learned considerably more than one thing, but this was the one that applied right now. It was this. Men who came to take something always made better decisions when they were warm and had been fed. And she needed these 3 men to make decisions. Just not the ones they thought they were going to make. The knock came at 11:30, 3 knocks. Evenly spaced, not aggressive, not tentative. The knock of someone who has decided in advance how many knocks is the correct number for a professional call and has practiced the interval. Nora dried her hands again. She had been peeling turnips and walked to the door with the unhurried pace that was simply how she walked everywhere. She opened it, 3 men on her porch. She looked at them the way she had looked at the valley that morning, not cataloging, not reacting. Reading, the one in the middle spoke first. Medium height, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, a coat that had been good quality once and was still trying, voice controlled. Trained to give nothing away, ma'am. I apologize for calling without prior notice. My name is Wade Cutter. I represent. Come in, Nora said. He blinked, just once. The blink of a man whose prepared sentence has been interrupted before it got to the part he rehearsed. We don't want to impose. Coffee's made, she said. Come in. She turned and walked back inside. After a moment they followed. because that was the first thing she had calculated that they would follow. Men like these operated from a script. The script required the target to be frightened, or defensive, or cooperative, out of fear of being frightened. When the target did none of those things, when the target simply turned her back and walked away from them, the script failed. And men whose script has failed have to improvise. And improvisers make mistakes. She pulled the fourth chair out from the table and set it against the wall, so there were 4 seats available, and she had already chosen which one she was going to occupy. The one with her back to the fireplace and her face to the door. The one that put the window's morning light directly in the eyes of anyone sitting across from her. She had moved the table 6 inches to the left 2 days ago to make this work exactly right. Small things. The sum of small things was everything. The chairs scraped. The coffee poured. The 3 men arranged themselves with the unconscious strategy of professionals. Cutter across from her, the big one, Briggs Malone. To her left where he could see the door, the young one, Chet Quarles, standing near the window, as if he had simply forgotten to sit, as if Nora wrapped both hands around her cup. Let the silence run for a count of 10. She had found that most people could not tolerate silence past 8. At 6, Cutter said, "We've heard you may be looking to sell the property." She nodded slowly. "Who told you that? Not a question. A statement wearing a question's shape. Word gets around," he said. "A widow, living alone, this far out, a widow," she said. He paused. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean, my husband's been dead 3 years," she said. "You don't need to be careful with the word. He was Callum Drum. He was a U.S. Deputy Marshal. He was shot in October of 1880. I'm sure you know all of this already, a beat." Cutter smiled, a good smile, practiced. The kind that communicated warmth without actually producing any. "I was sorry to hear about Marshal Drum, were you?" The smile held. "But something behind it didn't. The property," Malone said. First words he had spoken, low voice. The kind that occupied more room than its volume warranted. "What are you asking for it?" "I haven't decided," Nora said. "Ballpark." I said, "I haven't decided." She looked at him steadily. "You'll know when I decide." Malone looked at his coffee, and she looked at his right hand, which was resting on the table. Large. Calloused. The knuckle of the index finger slightly thicker than the others mitts in the way of men who have fired a weapon regularly for many years. And on his right wrist, just below the cuff of his shirt, there was a scar. Not a knife scar, not a burn, a specific shape. An old wound, deep and then healed badly. The shape of something that had torn rather than cut. The kind you get from a fence wire at full speed, or a rope, under sudden violent tension. She looked at it for exactly as long as she would look at any other part of a man's wrist. Then she looked back at her coffee. Callum had described it to her 17 days before he died, not intending to describe it as something she would need. He was talking while she was mending. He did that sometimes. Thought out loud when he was working through a problem. And she had learned over 15 years of marriage that the right response was silence, and the appearance of attention to her own task, because if he thought she was listening too carefully, he would stop. He said, "There was a man at the land office. Been there 3 times in the last month, signing off on eviction notices. Something about him was wrong. Not wrong in a way Callum could name yet. Wrong in the way a lock feels when you have the right key, but someone has been at the mechanism." He said, "The man had a scar on his right wrist. Torn rather than cut. The kind you get from a fence wire at speed or a rope under sudden tension." He said, "The man's name on the documents was listed as a deputy sheriff from Taos County. But the way he handled himself at the land office was not the way of a man following orders. It was the way of a man giving them." Callum said, "I can't prove anything yet. But I wrote it down." Nora had kept mending, and now that scar was 4 feet away from her, on the other side of her table, wrapped around a tin cup she had filled with her own coffee. She did not look at it again. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly what she was dealing with. The conversation that followed lasted another 30 minutes and said almost nothing of substance. Cutter did most of the talking. Property values in the territory. The difficulty of maintaining land alone. He mentioned, without quite mentioning, that the political situation in Colfax County was unsettled. A word he chose with care, and that a woman without, another careful pause. Without proper support. In such circumstances, "I managed the Raton Pass crossings for 8 years, Nora said." He stopped. "Scout work. Wagon trains, survey parties, government mail in the winters when nobody else would take the route. I spent one winter in a snow camp above 9,000 feet with 6 feet of drifts and a mule that had considerably better sense than the man I was working for. She looked at him calmly. I've been managing without assistance for quite a long time. Mr. Cutter, a pause, of course, he said. Quarles, near the window, made a sound that might have been a laugh. Immediately suppressed. Professionally suppressed. But there. She looked at him for the first time since he had chosen to stand rather than sit. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and his right leg bent at the knee, the foot propped against the baseboard, the pose of a young man performing ease. But his eyes were not easy. They were watchful, alert in the way of someone who had learned early, and at cost that inattention has consequences. He was looking at the room the way she looked at terrain. She filed that away. She told them they were welcome to water their horses at the trough behind the house. The nearest hotel was back at the Copper Nail. 2 rooms above the saloon, not comfortable but dry. She said it without inflection. The way you give a stranger directions to a road you know perfectly well they are not going to take, because she was offering them the option of leaving. And she was doing it because she knew they wouldn't. Cutter said it was a long ride from Cimarron. They were tired. He hoped she wouldn't mind if they stayed in the area for a few days while they continued their conversations about the property. Of course, she said. Same words he had used, same tone. Close enough to make the point without making it loud. She showed them out, stood in the doorway and watched them walk their horses toward the main street. Malone's horse, gray roan, solidly built. Quarles's bay with a white sock on the left foreleg. Cutter rode a black. Perfectly black, too perfect. The kind of horse you chose when you cared about how you appeared on horseback. She watched until they turned the corner past Speck's general store. Then she went back inside, took the small notebook from her apron pocket, wrote 3 names under the date. W. Cutter, B. Malone, C. Quarles. She looked at the names. She had known 2 of them already. The third, Quarles, she did not know. Not yet. She circled his name, closed the notebook, and started thinking about supper. They came back at 5 o'clock, all 3 of them, which she had expected. She had also expected Cutter to have spent the afternoon doing what careful men do in unfamiliar towns. Asking questions of the right people in the right tone, assembling a picture. She had expected him to return with either more confidence or less, depending on what he'd been told. She had told people in this town things over 3 years, in precisely the proportions she intended. Orville Speck knew she had been a trail guide. He did not know the specific routes, or for how long, or what she had encountered. Hattie Greer at the post office knew Nora's husband had been killed, and that Nora did not talk about it. She did not know what Callum had told Nora in the last months of his life. The blacksmith, Ira Bonds, knew everything, but nobody was going to find that out by asking around town. She had set the table with 4 plates. She had made a pot of pinto beans with salt pork, a pan of cornbread, and a dish of stewed tomatoes from her garden. Simple food. The kind that had no statement in it. The kind that said, "This is what I have, and I am giving it to you without ceremony." They should absolutely read something into the giving. They were sitting at her table eating her food. And whatever happened next, that would remain true. She had fed them. They had been in her home at her invitation, eating from her kitchen. Small things. The conversation at supper was easier than the morning. Less performance on Cutter's side. He had relaxed slightly. Whatever he'd learned in the afternoon had apparently been non-threatening, which meant it had been exactly what she had arranged for people to know. He talked about the railroad. The Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe line had come through the territory 3 years back, in 1880, and everything was changing because of it. Land that had been worthless was now adjacent to a rail corridor. Land that had been worked by settler families for 15 years was suddenly worth money to people who hadn't been anywhere near it when those families were breaking the ground. He talked about this the way you talk about weather. As fact. As impersonal force. She listened the way she always listened, fully without expression, storing what she needed. Malone ate without talking. That was fine. She wasn't learning from what he said. She was learning from the angle of his shoulders, from the way his eyes moved to the door every 12 to 14 minutes, the way a man's eyes move to exits when he is in a space he does not control. Quarles ate fast, the way young men eat after a full day in the saddle. He had taken the chair nearest the window, the same position he had chosen in the morning, and he had put his back to the wall, which was not something men did automatically, unless they had learned to do it the way you learn to breathe. Young. But he had learned things. She wondered where. She looked at him when she was reasonably sure he was not looking at her, which was less often than she would have liked, because he was more observant than he appeared to be. After supper, Cutter said they would need to discuss business properly tomorrow. Tomorrow, she said, if that suits you. It suits me fine. He thanked her for the meal with genuine courtesy, a man with enough self-awareness to recognize good food and enough manners to say so, even in the middle of a game of angles. She saw them to the door, watched them go down the road in the dark. She closed the door, stood in the quiet of her kitchen, with the plates still on the table and the lamp burning low and the notebook sitting where the coffeepot had been in the morning. And she felt something that took her a moment to name. Not satisfaction, something closer to what she used to feel on a mountain trail when the weather was turning, and she could see, far ahead, the exact point where the path would narrow and the footing would change, and everything after that moment would depend entirely on everything done before it. She was at that point, and she was ready. That night, Nora Drum did not sleep. Not because she was frightened. She had known frightened in her life, known it well, knew exactly what it felt like in her body, and what it did to her thinking. This was not that. This was something else. Something older. Something closer to the state she used to enter on the night before a difficult crossing. A sharpening. A narrowing of attention to the things that mattered, and a quiet, untroubled setting aside of everything that didn't. She sat in the chair by the fireplace with no lamp lit. The fire had burned down to coals. She did not add wood. Let the light be what it was. Red and low and without ceremony. And she sat in it and she worked. Not worried thinking. Working thinking. The kind that moves through a problem the way water moves through rock. Not forcing, not hurrying. Finding the way that is already there. She thought about Cutter first, because Cutter was the one who talked. And people who talk tell you things whether they mean to or not. Not in their words, in the space around their words, in what they carefully avoid saying, and what they can't quite help letting through. He had talked about the railroad, about land values, about the changing political situation in the territory. He had not mentioned Forrest Lund, not once. A man hired by Forrest Lund to come to the house of a dead marshal's widow and recover documents that could bring Lund's entire operation down. That man had sat at her table for 2 hours and had not said the name of the man who sent him, which told her Cutter was careful. She had already assumed that. But there were degrees of careful. Now she had a calibration. She thought about Malone second. Because Malone was the one who was trying to not exist in her memory. Sitting there eating her beans and not meeting her eyes and keeping his right wrist turned inward under the edge of his sleeve for the entire meal. He had noticed that she noticed. She was sure of that. Not sure she had been obvious enough for him to be certain, but sure she had been visible enough to make him uncomfortable. He would be watching her more carefully tomorrow. Looking for the moment she revealed what she knew, or suspected, or didn't know. She needed him to keep watching, needed his attention on her, because attention has to come from somewhere. The more of it that was pointed at Nora Drum, the less of it was pointed somewhere else. She thought about Quarles last, the young one. The one who sat with his back to the wall and ate fast, and watched the room the way she watched terrain. She had circled his name, because she did not yet understand him, and the things she didn't understand were the things she had to think most carefully about. That was what had kept her alive in the mountain passes for 8 years, in weather that killed men 20 years younger. Not the things she knew. Knowing things was just the entry price. The real work was attending to the things she didn't know yet. Quarles had not spoken at supper, one word. When she offered him more cornbread, he had said, "Yes, ma'am." That was all. But the way he said it was not dismissive. It was private. As if his courtesy was his own business and he was not particularly interested in performing it for an audience. She had met men like that. Not many. They were either very simple or very complicated, and there was no way to know from the outside which you were dealing with. She needed to find out, The fire went completely cold somewhere around 2 in the morning. She did not add wood. She sat in the dark for another hour, going over her preparations the way you run a river route in your mind, before you commit to it. Every turn, every drop, every place where the current shifts without warning. 11 days ago, she had sent the documents to Santa Fe, not by mail, not by stage, by hand with Ira Bonds, who had ridden to Rayton and caught the southbound rail connection, and ridden again from the station to the U.S. Marshal's office in Santa Fe, and placed the sealed envelope in the hands of a man named Aldous Trent, whom Callum had mentioned twice in the last months of his life with the tone he reserved for the very few people he trusted without reservation. She did not know if the documents had been received properly, did not know what was happening in Santa Fe right now, at 2 in the morning, in whatever office housed, whatever process had been set in motion. But she knew one thing: Ira had come back 9 days ago, and he had not said anything to her in public. That was what she had asked of him. But when he passed her on the street, he had touched the brim of his hat in a way that was not a greeting, a signal, arranged between them before he left. It meant delivered. Received. She had kept walking, had not stopped, had not changed her pace or her expression or the direction of her eyes. But something in her chest had shifted, not relief. Not yet. Relief was for when it was over, and it was not over. Something smaller, something more like the first step held, now the rest of them. She rose at 4:30, made coffee in the dark, lit a single lamp at the kitchen window, the way she did every morning, the way she had done every morning for 3 years, because consistency was invisible, and invisibility was useful, and she had made an art form out of both. She took the notebook from the table, the old one, Callum's handwriting on the inside cover. When the time is right, you will know. You always knew the terrain better than me. She read it the way she always read it. Not for comfort. She had never read it for comfort. She read it because it was true, and because true things needed to be held in the mind at certain moments, the way you hold a handhold on a cliff face. Not for reassurance, for grip. She set it down, picked up the smaller one, the working notebook, opened it to the current page. September 14, morning. 3 riders west approach. On time, below it she wrote, September 15, preparations complete. 3 inside the perimeter. Ira confirmed delivery. Proceed. She closed the notebook, put it in her pocket, drank her coffee. Outside, the sky was beginning to change at the eastern edge. The first thin line of light coming up behind the mesas, the color of heated metal, not yet committed to being morning. That hour before dawn, when the dark is at its quietest. She watched it, and she thought clearly and without emotion. They came for a document that is no longer here. They do not know that yet. They will come back this morning to conduct their business. And sometime in that conversation, the world they walked into Harlan's Crossing believing in is going to stop being true. And everything that happens after that moment depends entirely on everything done before it. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, straightened the chairs at the table, went out to feed her garden before the heat rose, and she had more complicated things to attend to. At 5:40 in the morning, Nora Drum was back on her front porch, standing, not sitting. She looked west Imper Road, red rock, juniper against a sky going from black to the color of blue iron. A hawk working the morning thermals above the mesa rim, barely moving, hanging in the air on something invisible, perfectly still in its motion. Nothing moved on the road yet, but it would. She knew exactly when. She always knew the terrain better than anyone. That was the thing about guiding people through difficult country for 8.5 years. You didn't just learn the roads. You learned to read how far a rider would come in a day, how early men rose when they were not comfortable in a place, how discomfort made you slow and slow made you predictable. 3 men from the Copper Nail, in 2 rooms above a saloon that was not their saloon, sleeping in beds that were not their beds. They would be up by 6. They would be at her door by 7. She watched the hawk. It hung in the air without effort, without apparent will, just the wind under its wings and the instinct that said, wait, watch. The right moment will come. She watched it for a count of 20. Then she went inside to make breakfast. They came at 7 minutes past 7, not 7 o'clock. 7 minutes past, which told her something. 7 o'clock would have been punctual. 7 minutes past was calculated, the kind of lateness that says, we are not in a hurry. We are not anxious. We arrive when we choose to arrive. Except they were anxious. She could hear it in the knocks as yesterday. Same controlled cadence, but the intervals between them were slightly shorter. Not much, a fraction of a second each. The kind of difference that a person does not consciously hear, but that the body registers anyway, the way the body registers a change in barometric pressure before the storm is visible. She opened the door. All three of them. Same positions as yesterday. Cutter in the center, Malone to the left. Quarles costed, but today he was not performing ease. Today he stood straight, weight even, hands visible and low. A man who had decided overnight to stop performing and start paying full attention. She noted that. "Good morning," Cutter said. "Come in." "Coffee's ready." The table was set the same as yesterday in one way and differently in another. 4 cups. Coffee pot in the center. No food. She had not offered food this morning and did not intend to. Yesterday's supper had established something. Today was different. Today was business, and she wanted the furniture of the room to say so. They sat. She poured. She sat down across from Cutter and wrapped her hands around her cup and waited. He let the silence run for maybe 4 seconds, which for Cutter, who was patient by professional habit, was not long at all. "Mrs. Drum, I think it would be best if we spoke plainly this morning." "I'd prefer that," she said. "We're not here about the property." "I know." A pause. The pause of a man recalculating. "You know, you're not property buyers," she said. "Property buyers don't send 3 men. And property buyers don't send men who carry their guns the way yours do." Quarles shifted his weight. Just slightly. Malone looked at the table. Cutter held very still. "What do you think we're here for?" Nora set her cup down, looked at him directly. Not with hostility. Not with fear. With the quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent years in situations where being wrong was not an option they could afford. "The documents my husband left," she said. The room did not move. Nothing moved. The coffee pot sat there. The cups sat there. The morning light came through the window at its low September angle and hit inside Cutter's face and showed every small muscle that was working not to react. Then she said the second part, quickly. "The way you say something that is not a threat because it has already happened, and threats belong to the future. The documents that are no longer here." Cutter put his cup down, slowly, deliberately. The sound of tin on wood. Small sound. Very large meaning. "What do you mean?" he said. "No longer here. 11 days ago," Nora said. "I sent them to Santa Fe." "Nothing. That's..." Cutter started. "A sealed affidavit," she said. Callum's sworn statement before Commissioner Aldous Trent. Dated August of 1880. 23 named witnesses. Dates, locations, transaction records. The names of men who gave orders and the names of the men who carried those orders out. She paused. "One beat. All of it." Cutter said nothing. Malone's right hand moved. Just slightly. An involuntary motion, a reflex reaching for something that wasn't there, because he'd had enough sense this morning to leave it at the copper nail. And Quarles. Quarles looked at the window. Not as strategy, not as calculation. He just looked at the window, at the September morning outside, at the road visible at an angle through the glass, and his face did something Nora could not quite name. Not panic, not anger. Something more like a young man who has just understood the actual shape of a situation that he had only been told the edges of. "You're lying," Cutter said. "Maybe," Nora said. He waited. "But if I'm not," she said. She let that sit there. "If I'm not." 3 words. The weight of 3 years inside them. The silence went on for a long time. Long enough that the morning light shifted by a degree. Long enough that a horse in the livery stable made a complaint about something, and then went quiet. Long enough that Briggs Malone turned his cup in his hands. 3 full rotations. A gesture he probably did not know he was making. Cutter was the first to move. He pushed back from the table. Controlled. A man making space to think. He stood and walked to the far end of the room, near the fireplace, and stood with his back to it and his face to the room. The position of someone who wanted to see everything at once. "When," he said, 11 days ago. "I told you sent it how? With someone I trust. Through Rayton." On the rail connection south, she picked up her coffee, drank, set it down. "It's been in the marshal's office in Santa Fe for 9 days. You don't know that. I do know that. A beat." "How?" "Because the person who delivered it came back," she said. And that was the moment, not the biggest one. The biggest was still coming. But that was the moment the room changed, the way air changes before lightning, a quality of pressure, a sense of charge. Imposter because Cutter had come to Harlan's Crossing, leaving 3 days behind a problem that could still be solved. He had believed he was coming to retrieve a document from a grieving widow living alone at the end of a dirt road. A woman who was, by all reports, quiet and self-contained, and not particularly connected to the machinery of the territory. He had not believed he was 9 days too late, and now he was standing in front of her fireplace with his hands at his sides, and his carefully maintained expression showing, for the first time, its edges. She watched those edges appear. She did not feel triumphant. That was not what this was. Triumph was for games. This was not a game. This was 3 years and 1 dead man, and 23 witnesses whose names were in a sealed document, moving through a system that Callum Drum had trusted with the last months of his life. This was not triumph. This was the moment when the terrain did exactly what she had expected it to do. And the next part began. It was Malone who broke first. Not all the way, not in any obvious manner. Just a crack, the kind that appears in old wood when the temperature changes, invisible from a distance, unmistakable up close. He stood up from the table. Didn't say anything. Just stood. Walked to the window. Stood at the window with his back to the room. Looking out, Nora watched his back, big man. The kind of big that comes not from size alone, but from the way a person occupies space, as if the space around them has learned to make room without being asked. He had the posture of a man who had been large his whole life, and had learned early that large men could get away with not explaining themselves. His right wrist. Under the cuff. She had been careful not to look at it again this morning. Not once since they arrived. Because the second time you look at something you should not know is significant, is the time the person notices you looking. She had looked once. Yesterday. 4 feet across the table. That was enough, and enough. She turned to Cutter. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her. Just looked. Like he was deciding whether to. Then he sat. "I want to tell you something," she said. "I'm listening." His voice was level, the professional voice. She gave him credit for recovering it that fast. "When Callum was killed," she said, "the territory's report said he was killed by persons unknown. In the performance of his duties," she paused. "I want you to understand what that phrase meant to me. Persons unknown. I read those words and I thought, there are men who know exactly who did this. Men who filed that report knowing they were writing a lie. Men who are going to go home tonight to their families and eat their supper and sleep without difficulty." She looked at her coffee, and I thought, all right, they think this is over. They think the widow will leave, or stay and be quiet. They think the document is lost because nobody knows. Callum left me a copy. She looked back at Cutter. "They thought wrong," she said. Cutter said nothing. "I waited 3 years," she said. "Not because I was frightened, because I was waiting for the right conditions." "What conditions?" "A new judge, an honest one, and a reason for the right people to look at Colfax County specifically." She paused. "The Maxwell Land Grant Company's case went to the Supreme Court last spring. The territory is under federal scrutiny that has nothing to do with me. A sworn affidavit from a dead U.S. Marshal about land fraud and murder, submitted to the Marshal's office at this particular moment, is not a document that can be quietly buried." Cutter was quiet for a long time. Then, "You planned this, not a question." "Callum and I planned it," she said, "before he died. He told me, wait for the right current. Then put the boat in." Malone turned from the window, turned slowly. The way large things turn, with the weight of the decision behind every degree of rotation. He looked at her. She looked at him. And something passed between them that was not a conversation, and was not an accusation, and was not anything so simple as recognition. It was the specific awareness of 2 people who have been in the same room for years without knowing it and have just now understood that fact. She said his name. Briggs Malone, quietly. Simply. The way you say a name when you are not trying to do anything with it, except make sure the person wearing it understands that you know it. He said nothing. "You were working as deputy sheriff out of Taos County in the fall of 1880, she said. "Not on official assignment, not on any official record, working privately. For compensation that did not appear in any county ledger." His jaw tightened, just slightly, but it was enough. "Callum described you," she said. "Specifically." A silence. He described your wrist, she said. She said it without looking at his wrist. That was the point, that she could say it without needing to look. That she had already looked, and she did not need to look again, ever. He wrote it down. In 31 pages of sworn statement for Commissioner Trent in August of 1880. 2 months before he died. A pause. Your name is in that document, Mr. Malone. Your description. The name of the man who paid you. The room was very quiet, and then Quarles, from the corner where he had not moved or spoken in 20 minutes, said 2 words. Forrest Lund. First words he had spoken all morning. Just 2. But they landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Rings going out in every direction, touching every surface, changing the quality of everything they reached. Cutter turned to look at him. Malone turned to look at him. Quarles looked at neither of them. He was looking at Nora. That's who hired you, he said. Lund, not a question either. Yes, she said. And Quarles nodded, once, slowly. The nod of a young man who has just understood something he wishes he did not understand. She had planned for the conversation to break at this point, not fall apart. Break. The way a river breaks around a rock, divides into separate channels, goes in different directions, finds its own way around the obstacle and continues forward. She needed it to break because she needed each of these 3 men to go somewhere different in his head, and they could not do that in a unified group. Cutter needed to sit with what it meant for him. With the timeline. With his name in a document 9 days away in a federal office, Maloney needed to sit with his name being said in this room by this woman. With whatever that did to the inside of a man who has been carrying a thing for 3 years. And Quarles. She was not sure yet what Quarles needed, but he needed something. That much she could see. I have work to do in the garden this morning, she said. Cutter looked at her. You're welcome to stay. Coffee's there, she stood. I'll be back in an hour. She picked up her apron from the hook by the door. She went out to the garden, which was an act of such complete and unhurried confidence that it took all 3 of them a full moment to absorb it. She had just told them their plan had failed. Named a murderer to his face. Confirmed that the document they came for was 9 days gone in a federal office in Santa Fe. And then she had gone to tend her tomatoes, as if the matter was, if not concluded, then at least sufficiently addressed for the morning. The garden was behind the house, south-facing where she got the most sun. 20 yards long, 12 wide. More than one person needed, which had been the point from the beginning. She had always grown enough to share, which gave her reasons to be in people's lives. In their kitchens, in their conversations, in the peripheral awareness they kept of their neighbors. She moved along the tomato row, with her hands working on their own, checking for split skins, pulling the ones that were ready, setting them in her basket. She was listening. Her hearing had always been better than people expected. The stone walls of the house were thick, but the kitchen window was cracked open 3 inches. Opened that morning specifically for the purpose of hearing what happened in her kitchen when she left it. Yet, low voices. Cutter's controlled tone. Malone's, she could hear that as clearly as words. The absence of his voice was as loud as anything in that room. Then Quarles. Something short and sharp. The rhythm of a statement rather than a question. Cutter responded. Longer. More controlled. Then silence again. She picked 3 tomatoes. Set them in the basket, moved to the squash. Inside, Cutter was sitting at her table with both hands flat on the wood and his eyes on the middle distance, going through the architecture of what had just changed and what could still be done. The document was gone. That was the new fact. The details she had provided, the name Trent, the rail connection through Rayton, the 9-day timeline, those were not the details of a bluff. Those were the details of something that had actually happened. So the document was going to be read, which meant names were going to surface, his name. He had taken money from Forrest Lund on 4 separate occasions between 1879 and 1882. Not for violence. He had never done violence for money. For information. For the strategic disappearance of certain documents from certain offices. For the kind of professional assistance a man with his background could provide to a man with Lund's resources. His name was in a dead marshal's sworn statement. His name was sitting in an office in Santa Fe. He spread his hands on the table, looked at them, then said to Malone without looking up, She's been planning this for 3 years. Malone said nothing. She waited for us to come here. She sent the document when she knew we were coming. How did she know we were coming? Malone said, because she told someone she was thinking of selling. A pause, and she knew Lund would hear it. A long silence, then, she's 62 years old and she lives alone. Yes, Cutter said. We miscalculated. Yes, Cutter said. We did. Quarles had moved to the doorway, not outside. Just at the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, looking out at the garden where the old woman was moving along her squash row with her basket and her unhurried hands. He watched her. She moved like someone who knew exactly where she was going and had no particular feelings about whether you watched her get there. That walk, that specific, distance-eating walk that did not ask for your attention or acknowledge that it was receiving it. He knew that walk, had seen something like it before, once. A long time ago. In a place very far from here. He couldn't place it precisely. It lived just at the edge of memory, just past the point where you could put your hand on it. The moment you reached for it directly, it moved back. He watched her pick a tomato, set it in the basket, move on. He thought, she is not afraid of us. And then, more slowly, with the weight of something arriving rather than being stated, she has never been afraid of us. Not since the moment she opened the door. Which meant everything she had done since they arrived. Every cup of coffee and every offered chair, and every word and every silence, had been exactly as deliberate as a move on a chessboard. Which meant they were not here to negotiate. They had never been here to negotiate. They were here because she needed them here. He turned that over. He looked at the basket of tomatoes in her hands. He thought, who does she need us for? She came back inside at 9:20, set the basket on the counter, washed her hands at the basin, dried them on her apron. The three men were approximately where she had left them, which told her something about the quality of what had passed between them in her absence. People who have reached agreement rearrange themselves. People who haven't tend to stay in their corners. Three men. Three expressions that were not showing her what was underneath them. They were managing their reactions now. The shock of an hour ago processed and contained. Operating as professionals again. Good. She needed them thinking clearly. She sat down. I want to be direct with you, please, Cutter said. The document in Santa Fe is going to result in an inquiry. That inquiry will take time. Months, possibly longer. The territory moves slowly. That has always been the problem. She paused. But it will move. Because the people looking at it have a reason to look at Colfax County. That has nothing to do with me. The Maxwell Land Grant case. The Supreme Court. The federal attention in New Mexico territory right now is unlike anything this region has seen. The timing of Callum's affidavit is not accidental. What are you telling us, Cutter said, that Forrest Lund is going to be subpoenaed within weeks or months, not years. And when that happens, the people who worked for him are going to be examined. All of them. She let that land. I'm not a prosecutor, not a judge. I'm not even a citizen with particular standing in this territory's legal system. I'm a widow living at the end of a dirt road. She looked at each of them in turn. What I'm telling you is that the window of time in which any of you can make a choice about where you stand when that inquiry begins is not a large window. Cutter looked at her for a long moment. What would that choice look like? That's not my question to answer. That's yours. And the marshals, a pause. But men who come forward before their name tend to be treated differently than men whose names are found without their cooperation. It was Quarles who spoke next. He had been silent since his two words, Forrest Lund, and the silence had been the silence of a man deciding when to say the thing he was going to say. How long have you known about Malone? Direct, not accusatory. To her since yesterday morning, she said, when you opened the door, when I saw his wrist, what? Callum's description was specific. Quarles absorbed this. You didn't say anything. No. Why? Because I needed him here, she said. Not gone, a pause. And now Quarles said, now the inquiry is going to find his name. Along with everything else, Quarles turned to Malone. Malone had not looked up. Briggs, Quarles said, nothing. Briggs, sharper now, not loud. But with an edge in it that had not been there before. Maloney looked up. The two men looked at each other. Something passed between them. Not friendship, exactly. The bond of people who have worked together in conditions where trust was a functional requirement rather than a sentiment. Quarles said, this is what it is. Malone looked at him. This is what it is, quietly. Like a fact. like the temperature of water. Maloney looked back at the table, and then did something she had not expected from him. He exhaled, not dramatically, not as a performance of any emotion, just air leaving a body that had been holding it for too long. The exhale of a very large man who has been carrying something very heavy and has, in this moment, simply set it down. Not because he wanted to, because he could not carry it anymore. She gave them the rest of the morning. She moved through her kitchen and her house with the unhurried competence that was simply how she existed in her own space, and she let the three men occupy their corners and their silences without interference, because there was something else about to happen. And it required them to be looking in exactly the right direction when it did. She heard it before she saw it, a sound that Cutter and Quarles probably could not have identified, but that she recognized immediately. The register of a crowd trying to be quiet. Not a single voice, not a conversation. The collective low presence of many people holding their volume down intentionally, which produced a sound very different from natural quiet. Natural quiet was empty. This was full. She went to the front window. They were there, 22 people, by her quick count, maybe more at the edges, standing in the road in front of her house. Not a mob, not an angry gathering. A group of people who had come to a specific place with a specific purpose, and were standing at it with the patience of people who had learned that patience was the only tool they reliably had. Men and women, old and middle-aged. The Kettner family from the South Pasture. Orville Speck from the general store, who had closed the store to be here, which told you everything about what he thought was at stake. Hattie Greer from the post office. 3 of the Arroyo Creek cattle families. The schoolteacher, young Fitch. Doris Crane, who ran the laundry and did not go anywhere she was not absolutely certain about. All of them standing in the road, some of them armed, not waving weapons, not displaying them, just armed. In the way that people who live on the frontier are always armed, because a rifle in the hands of a man standing still in a road is simply a fact about the world he inhabits. Cutter appeared at her shoulder. She heard him absorb what he was seeing. A long moment, then, "How long have you been planning that?" 2 weeks. "You organized them. I spoke to people," she said. "I told them what was in the document, what Callum had written, what was likely to happen and what it meant for the land they were farming and fighting to keep." She paused. "I didn't ask them to come out. I gave them the information and left the decision to them." "They came out," Cutter said. "Yes, they did." Ira Bonds was there, at the back of the group, standing slightly apart, and not because he was uncertain, but because he was the kind of man who stood at the back, so he could see the whole picture at once. He caught her eye through the window. She did not nod. He did not nod. They had no gesture for this moment. There was no gesture needed. He had done what she asked. She had done what she told him she would do. And the thing set in motion 9 days ago when he walked through a door in Santa Fe with a sealed envelope was moving forward now under its own weight. Quarles was standing in the kitchen doorway, one shoulder against the frame, looking at her. "Who are they?" he said. "People who live here, who farm the land around this town, who have been losing pieces of that land for 5 years to eviction notices and fraudulent surveys and instruments that Forrest Lund's lawyers produced in a territorial court that found it convenient to rule in his favor." She set her cold coffee cup down. "Callum's affidavit names 47 specific transactions. False surveys, backdated claims, evictions executed on the basis of forged documents. Most of the people standing outside have family members who lost land in those transactions, or lost it themselves." Quarles looked at the gathering. Something shifted in his expression. Something more complicated than sympathy. Something that happens in the face of a young man who has just discovered that the edges of a situation extend much further than he was told. "Lund told you this was simple," she said. He looked at her. "A widow. A document. A quiet transaction in a quiet town. He didn't tell you what the document contained, or who was in it, or how many people's lives it had touched." Quarles was quiet for a moment, then, "No, he didn't." Flat. Careful. Exact. Malone had moved while she was watching Quarles, to the north end of the room, near the fireplace, near the shelf of books. He was looking at the one she had left open the night before, face down, because she had fallen asleep in her chair and had not bothered to close it properly when she woke. He picked it up, looked at the open page. at the marginal note in her small, precise handwriting. Something she had written 2 years ago, one of those nights when a thought needed to be somewhere outside her own head. He read it, set the book back down, did not say what it said. Just looked at the fireplace for a long moment, then said, to no one in particular. She was going to see all of it, not a question. The most specific thing he had said all morning. She did not ask what he meant. She knew what he meant. He meant, Callum Drum's wife was always going to see this through to the end. And somewhere in that shelf of worn books and that open page with her handwriting in the margin, the fact of that was visible in a way that nothing he had been told about Nora Drum had prepared him for. She went to the kitchen and put fresh water on. Outside, 22 people stood in the morning sun. Inside, 3 men sat with the weight of what they had walked into, and she was making coffee, because clear heads required something warm to hold, and she was the person who provided that in this house. Not because she was being kind, because preparation was everything, because the small things added up, because a cup of coffee in a man's hand was a reason to sit still, and sitting still was a reason to think, and thinking was what she needed all 3 of these men to do right now. Before the next thing happened, the water boiled. She poured, carried the pot back to the table, sat down, looked at the 3 men who had come to take something from her, and said, "There's more I need to tell you." She said, "There's more I need to tell you," and then she let that sentence sit there. Not for effect, not as performance, because what came next required each man to be in exactly the place he was in. Not physically, but internally, before she added the next weight to what was already on the scale. Cutter was recalculating. She could see it. The steady assessment of a man who had revised his plan once already this morning and was preparing to do it again. Malone was somewhere else entirely. The kind of elsewhere that happens inside a man who has been carrying a name for 3 years. His own name, the one that belonged to what he did in an alley on a Tuesday night in October, and has just heard a woman say it without flinching. And Quarles was looking at her with something in his face that he was not, apparently, making any effort to hide. She poured coffee into each cup, set the pot down, sat back. The document Callum left me contained 47 transactions. False surveys, backdated land claims, forged instruments. She paused, but it also contained something else. A second section, separate from the transaction records. Callum wrote down every name he could verify. Every person who received payment from Forrest Lund for services that were not official and were not legal. She looked at Cutter. "Yours is in there, Mr. Cutter. 4 transactions between 1879 and 1882. Information brokerage. Document suppression. The nature of each transaction is described in specific detail." Cutter held very still. "I'm telling you this not as a threat," she said, "as a fact. The inquiry that is going to begin in Santa Fe is going to find your name whether you act on this information or not. The only variable is the condition in which it finds you." Silence. Then Cutter said very quietly, "You're telling me to go to Santa Fe. I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your business." A pause. "But if I were in your position, I would not wait for the inquiry to come to me." Cutter stood up. He walked to the window for the 3rd time, and this time it was different from the first 2 times. The first time had been shock. The second time had been processing. This time was decision. She had learned the quality of a man's movement well enough to distinguish between them. He stood at the window and looked out at the gathering in the road. 22 people. Still there. Still quiet. Still patient in the way of people who understand that patience is the only form of power they reliably possess. He looked at them for a long time. Then said, without turning, "I need to think. Take your time," she said. He turned, looked at her. Something in his face that was not quite readable. Not gratitude, not hostility, not the professional blankness he had worn since arriving. Something in between all of those. Something human. "I'll come back," he said. Doors open. He walked out, not hurrying, not slow, just walking. The walk of a man who has decided something and is already executing the first step of it. The door closed behind him. 3 became 2. Malone had not moved. He was still in the north end of the room, near the fireplace, near the shelf of books. Quarles had moved while Cutter was at the window. He had come fully into the room, away from the doorway. Had taken a chair, not his usual window position, but one of the chairs at the table. He sat with his forearms on the wood and his hands loose, and his eyes on Nora, with the patience of a young man who has made some internal decision and is waiting for the right moment to say it. She looked at Malone. He felt it. He turned. They looked at each other across the length of the room, and she said, "I want to show you something." She went to the sleeping room. Came back with a folded piece of paper. Not old. The folds were crisp, not worn. She had looked at it 3 times. The first time to verify what it was. The second time to decide what to do with it. The third time last night, because last night had required looking at it one more time before today. She set it on the table. She did not unfold it. Callum wrote this. Not in the affidavit. Separate. He wrote it the same night he gave me the sealed envelope. In August of 1880, she looked at Malone. "It's addressed to you," she said. The room did not breathe. Malone looked at the folded paper, then at her, then at the paper again. "He knew your name," she said. "He knew your face. He knew what you were going to do. He did not know when. He wrote this in August of 1880. He was killed in October." A long silence. "He wrote it to you anyway," she said. Maloney crossed the room, not quickly. The way a man crosses a room when he is not sure what is waiting for him at the other end. One step at a time, each step considered. He stopped at the table, looked at the folded paper, picked it up. His hands, large, calloused, iron-strong, were not entirely steady. Just slightly. Just enough to show. He unfolded it. She watched him read. She had read it only 3 times. She knew the shape of what it said without knowing every exact word. The shape of Callum's thinking on the night he wrote it. Careful and direct, and without unnecessary heat, the same as always. He had written. He did not know if this letter would ever be read. He had written that he bore no particular malice toward the man who was going to do what he had been paid to do, because malice required a kind of personal investment in the outcome, and he had learned that personal investment clouded the thinking. He had written that he was sorry for the position this man was in, not because the position excused the choice, but because he had seen enough of this territory to understand how men got into positions they would not have chosen on their best day. He had written, "If you are reading this, you have survived longer than I did. I hope you used that time for something." He had signed it. Callum Drum, Deputy U.S. Marshal, Colfax County, New Mexico Territory, and below his name, in smaller letters, "I hope you sleep better than I imagine you do." Maloney stood at the table for a long time, holding the paper, not reading it anymore, just holding it. The paper made a small sound in his hands, just the tension of held paper, the faint flex of it in a large man's grip. Quarles was watching him from across the table. Quiet, not pushing. The kind of witness that a young man becomes when he understands that the moment in front of him is not his to speak into. Nora watched Malone's face. What she got was simpler than she had expected. His eyes closed, just for a moment. Just long enough for something to pass through him and come out the other side. Then they opened. He set the paper down. Carefully. Flat on the table, he said, "He was a good man," 7 words. But they felt like 2. Like the only ones. "Yes," she said. "He was. I know what I owe," Malone said. Not to her, not to Callum, to the room, to the fact of the thing. She did not tell him what to do with that knowledge. She had told him enough. The rest was his. "The gathering in the road," he said. "That's not for show. No, they'll hold me until the marshal comes," she said. "Yes," he nodded. Once. Heavy. Final. The nod of a man arriving at a place he has been heading toward for a long time without admitting it. He walked to the door, opened it, walked out to the road, and 22 people closed around him like a hand closing around. Something they had waited 3 years to hold. Just 2 of them now. Nora and the young man with the watchful eyes who sat with his forearms on her table and his hands loose and his face showing things he had apparently decided to stop hiding. She poured herself fresh coffee, sat down, looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for almost a full minute, which would have been uncomfortable with almost anyone else, but was not uncomfortable with Quarles. He had the stillness of a person who had learned that silence was not a vacancy that needed filling. She said, "You knew something was wrong before you came here." Not a question. He looked at her for a moment. Then, "Not specifically, but Lund doesn't send 3 people to talk to a widow about property," he said. "I knew that. What I didn't know was," he stopped. "What you were actually walking into," she said. "What I was actually walking into," he agreed. A pause. "You could have gone with Cutter," she said. I know. Why didn't you? He looked at his hands, then back at her. Because I want to understand something first. She waited. You said you weren't afraid, he said. When we came to the door yesterday, you opened it like you'd been expecting us. I had been expecting you. I know that now. But that's not what I mean. He leaned forward slightly. Most people, even people who have prepared, even people who have made every plan, when the thing they prepared for actually shows up at the door, there's still a moment. There's still a second where the body reacts before the mind catches up. He looked at her steadily. You didn't have that second, he said. A pause. I'm trying to understand what that looks like from the inside. She considered him. Not the question. She had answered that question for herself long ago. She was considering him, the specific shape of this young man who sat at her table, asking something that was not tactical, not self-serving, not anything other than what it presented itself as. Genuine, which was not something she had expected from any of the three of them. She said, How old are you? 34. Do you know how old I am? 62. Cutter found that out in town. When I was 34, she said, I was in my third year guiding wagon trains through Raton Pass. 14 crossings that year. Some in weather I would not have chosen, and some with parties not prepared for what they were going to encounter. She paused. You learn something on those crossings. You learn that fear is not your enemy. Fear is information. It tells you that something real is happening, and that it requires your full attention. She wrapped her hands around her cup, but fear can only serve you if you have done the preparation. If you have not prepared, fear becomes panic, and panic kills people on mountain passes, makes them run the wrong direction, choose the wrong crossing, trust the wrong weather. She looked at him. When I opened that door yesterday, I had been preparing for 3 years. I knew the terrain. I knew the variables. I knew within a reasonable margin what was going to happen. A pause. The second you're describing, she said. The body reacting before the mind. That second disappears when you have done enough work that your body already knows what the mind is about to think. Quarles looked at her. Then, you were a scout for 8 years. 8.5. And before that I was someone who grew up in hard country and had the particular bad luck, or good luck, depending on your vantage point, of learning early that the world did not adjust itself for your comfort. A pause. Appalachia, he said. Yes, hard country. The hardest kind, she said, the kind that doesn't look dangerous from the outside. Something shifted in his face. Not much. A degree. The way the angle of light shifts when a cloud moves past without you seeing the cloud itself, he said. I grew up in Missouri. She said nothing. River country. Different kind of hard. She said nothing, because she could hear that this was going somewhere of its own accord and did not require her to push it. My mother died when I was 11, he said. Fever. My father. He stopped. Started again. My father was not equal to the situation. Flat. Exact. The understatement of a man who had learned to describe a large thing with small words, because the small words were the only ones he could say in the voice he chose to keep. I left when I was 13. I was on the road for a long time before I ended up in Kansas. Before I found work that suited what I was good at. A pause. I was good at not being afraid, he said, or at least at looking like I wasn't. Which turns out to be almost the same thing when you're the one the other person is pointing at. She looked at him. I made a reputation out of it, he said, and the reputation made more work. And the work made the reputation bigger. He looked at his hands. And here I am, she said. Here you are. He looked up. In the house of a woman whose husband's documents you were hired to destroy, who is 62 years old and fed you supper last night and showed a dead man's letter to the person who killed him. A pause. And she is not afraid. No, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then, how do you do that? And she thought about it. Really thought. The way she thought about difficult terrain, not rushing to an answer, letting the answer come up from where the real understanding lived. And she said, You know every road out of Harlan's Crossing. He blinked. Once. The blink of a man who did not expect that sentence. You rode in from the west, she said. But you spent yesterday afternoon on horseback. I could see the dust from my back window. You went south. You went east. You came back from the north. She looked at him steadily. You were mapping the exits. The way a professional maps exits. The way someone maps exits when they are not entirely certain about the job they have agreed to take. He said nothing. The road south goes to the canyon, she said. Red Wall Canyon. 12 miles. The crossing at the bottom has been washed out since the August rains. There is no ford passable below a horse's chest until you get another 8 miles south to the Tewa crossing, and the Tewa crossing requires local knowledge of the submerged rocks. Or you lose the horse. She looked at him. The road east goes to open country, flat. No cover for 4 miles. A man on a fast horse with a head start might make it. A man being followed by people who know the terrain would not. She did not look away. And the road north, the one you came back from, goes up into the high country above the pass. Beautiful country. Terrible footing after dark. There is a section of trail that locals call the slide, because 3 years ago a man who did not know it tried to take it at dusk, and he and his horse went over the east face. She paused. You have no route out of Harlan's Crossing that I have not already accounted for. The room was very quiet. Quarles sat with this for a long moment, and then, slowly, he did something she had not seen him do once in the day and a half he had been in her house. He smiled. Not a performance. Not a professional expression. An actual smile. Small. Crooked at one corner. The smile of a man who has just encountered something that genuinely surprised him and found, to his own apparent astonishment, that he did not mind. You learned that, he said. All of it. Before you arrived, the exit routes, the footing on the slide, the water level at the Tewa crossing, the 4 miles of open ground to the east. She paused. I walked every route myself in the 2 weeks before you came. Not quickly, carefully, the way you walk a trail before you take a party through it. He looked at her. Because that's what this was, she said. A crossing. And I was the guide. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the walk, he said. She looked at him. I've been trying to place it since yesterday morning, the way you move. I said to myself, I know that walk. I've seen it before. In someone who had been through something the world didn't give them credit for. He paused. I couldn't place it specifically. But I could feel the shape of it. She said nothing. My mother walked like that, he said, before she died. When things were still possible, he looked at his hands. That's what I couldn't place. I hadn't thought about her walk in 20 years. The kitchen was quiet. The September light moved on the floor. Nora did not say she was sorry. She had learned long ago that saying you were sorry for something you did not cause was the easiest way to end a conversation that should continue. Instead, she said, Tell me about her. And he did. Quietly, carefully, in the small words he had learned to use for large things. And she listened the way she had always listened. Fully, without expression, storing what she needed, and honoring the rest with silence. At 11:30, there was a knock at the door. Not the 3 knock-knock of men announcing a professional call. 1 knock. The kind a person gives who has been expected. She said, Come in. The door opened. Ira Bonds. He had to duck slightly through the doorframe. Just the half-inch duck of a man who has misjudged this particular frame before and learned from it. He was carrying his hat in his hands, the way men carry their hats when they are in a place where they wish to show respect. In his left hand, a small envelope, not sealed. Open, the flap folded back. He looked at Quarles first, straight at him. The direct look of a man who wanted to know what was in the room before he said what he had come to say. Quarles met his eye, held it, then looked back at Nora. Ira looked at Nora. She nodded. He came in, set his hat on the corner of the table, set the envelope beside it. Did not sit down. Marshal Trent's office in Santa Fe. He said, I have a response. The letter arrived by post 4 days ago. I waited for the right time to bring it, she said. Tell me. Received. Reviewed. Assigned to investigation. Grand jury proceedings to be convened in October. He paused. They want the original affidavit logged with the territorial court by October 3rd. She looked at the envelope. There's a letter from Trent himself. He paused again. He said, and I'm quoting because I read it twice and wanted to get the words right, he said. Tell the widow that her husband's work will be completed. I knew Callum Drum. He deserved better than what he got. So does she. The kitchen was quiet. The kind of quiet that is not empty. The kind that is full of the weight of something that has been a long time coming and has finally, simply, arrived. Nora looked at the letter for a moment. Then she looked at Ira. Thank you, she said. He nodded. Once. The nod of a man who does not have words for what he is feeling, and has never had words for it and is not going to invent them now. He picked up his hat, put it on, went back out the door. She looked at the envelope on the table. She did not pick it up. Not yet. Some things you hold back not from fear and not from sentiment, but because the moment of picking them up should be the right moment, and this was not quite it. She looked at Quarles. October 3rd, she said. 17 days, he said. He had calculated it without apparent effort. Yes. The territorial court will need the affidavit logged. The grand jury will convene. And people whose names are in that document will have subpoenas served within 30 days of convening. He was quiet. That includes you, she said. I know. You weren't named in the transactions. Lund hired you after the period Callum documented. But you are going to be material to a grand jury investigation, I know, he said again. A pause. What are you going to do? She said. He looked at the envelope. He looked at his hands. He said, the honest thing. Whatever that requires. He said it the way he had said, Forrest Lund, exactly. Precise as a measurement, not as a performance of virtue. As a statement of intention, she believed him. She was not a woman who believed things easily or quickly or without reason. But she believed this. Because she had been watching him since the moment he arrived, and she had learned to read the difference between a man saying what he thought you wanted to hear and a man saying what he had actually decided. There's something else you should know, she said. He waited, the person who carried the affidavit to Santa Fe. Ira Bonds, yes. He didn't go alone. He was accompanied for the first 60 miles through the high country by a young man who came to Harlan's Crossing about a year ago, works at the livery. Doesn't talk much, has the hands of someone who has done a great deal of riding and the eyes of someone who grew up watching for trouble. Quarles looked at her. Forrest Lund has a son, she said. His name is Dewey. Quarles said, quickly, not fully surprised. The way you say a name when you have wondered about it long enough that hearing it confirmed feels like something settling rather than something landing. Dewey Lund. He came to me 14 months ago. He told me he knew what his father had done, that he could not undo it, that he did not know what else to do with that knowledge, except find the person who was trying to do something about it, and ask if there was a way to help. The light in the room at this hour, past noon now, the sun high enough to come through the south window at a different angle, warmer, broader, fell from the table and the envelope and the 2 cups of coffee, and made everything look very clear. The way terrain looks clear at midday when the shadows are small and the light shows you exactly what you are looking at. He volunteered. Quarles said, yes. He went to Santa Fe with Ira. He spoke to Marshal Trent directly, as a witness, as the son of the man being investigated. He gave a separate sworn statement, conversations he had heard in his father's house, men who came and went, payments he had seen made. Quarles was very still. His statement was part of the reason Trent moved as quickly as he did. A pause. Forrest Lund is going to be brought down, she said. Not by me. Not by Callum's affidavit alone, though that was the foundation. Not by the people standing in the road, though their presence today matters. He is going to be brought down by the accumulated weight of evidence from every direction. And some of that evidence came from his own house. From his own son, whom he raised in such a way that the boy could not live with what he knew. Quarles looked at the south window, at the light coming through it. He said very quietly, Lund doesn't know, no. He has no idea his son. No. He thinks he sent 3 men to a widow's house to recover a document and the widow didn't have it. He's sitting in his office right now, thinking the document is in federal hands and the rest of his operation is intact. Yes, she said. And it isn't. No, she said. It is not. She went outside at 2 in the afternoon because there was one thing left, one person left, and it required the outside, the road and the light, and the particular quality of open air that New Mexico Territory provided in September afternoons. Bright and dry, and without softness, and completely indifferent to the weight of human business being conducted under it. Malone was at the far end of the road. He had been there since he walked out into the gathering. The gathering had thinned. Some people had gone back to their work, but the core of them remained, and Malone was in their center, not restrained, not held physically, but surrounded. In the way a man is surrounded when the people around him have made clear they are not moving. He saw her come out. She walked toward him. The gathering. Not dramatically. They made a path. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was a big man. The kind of big that had been earned and not given. Hands that had done work. A face that had been through what this territory did to faces over decades. He said, "I'm not going to run, I know," she said. "I'll go to Santa Fe. Give whatever testimony." "I know," she said again. He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. Direct, clear. "Seeing what was there, he wrote to you because he thought you deserved to be spoken to like a person," she said. Malone was quiet. Callum always thought that, about everyone. Even the ones who... She stopped. Started again. "He said once that a man who does a wrong thing is not the same as a wrong man, that the two things were different, that the first could be addressed. The second was just a label." She paused. "I'm not Callum. I cannot tell you what I think of the first or the second. That is not mine to give." She looked at him directly. "What I can tell you is that you are going to be given the opportunity to stand in front of people and tell the truth. And what you do with that opportunity is yours to decide." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Did he forgive?" "He didn't write about forgiveness," she said. Gently, but directly, he wrote about what he hoped for you. "Those are different things." Malone looked at the ground. The afternoon light fell across the red dirt of the road, across the boots of the people standing in it, across the long shadows that the September sun made from the southwest, stretching everything out thin and long. He said, "All right, just that. 2 syllables. With the weight of a man who has decided something that cannot be undecided." She turned, walked back through the parted gathering, went back inside. The following morning, Cutter returned alone, on foot. He came at 8 o'clock and knocked 3 times, and she opened the door and he came in and sat down at the table without being invited to sit, which told her where he was. She poured coffee. He wrapped his hands around the cup. He said, "I'm going to Santa Fe." "All right," she said. "I have information that would be useful to a grand jury. Considerably more than what's in Callum's document. 4 years of operations, names, methods. Transactions that Lund structured through a third party specifically to avoid documentation." She said nothing. "I'm not doing this because it's the right thing," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I know you're not," she said. He looked at her. "You're doing it because it's the practical thing," she said. "And because you are, underneath the professional exterior, a man who is tired of being the kind of man you have been for the last several years. Those two things don't contradict each other." A pause. "You don't know me," he said. "No. But I've been watching people in difficult terrain for a long time. I have some experience with what a man looks like when he's made a decision that costs him something." Cutter looked at his coffee, then. "The Lund operation. How many people have lost land, counting the full 47 transactions?" Somewhere between 130 families." She paused. "Give or take, depending on how many of the evictions were executed before anyone understood what the legal instrument actually said." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know the scale of it," he said, "when I started working for him. By the time I understood..." He stopped. "By the time you understood, you were already in," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, that's how it works. Yes." She picked up her coffee. "The station master at Raton will have an outbound connection leaving Thursday morning. That gives you 2 days." He stood up. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face she did not have a precise name for. Something that was not quite gratitude and not quite respect, and was perhaps more complicated than either. "Callum Drum was a lucky man," he said. "In the ways that mattered." She did not respond to that. "Some things were true enough that they did not need acknowledgement from you in order to be true." He walked out. She watched him go down the road. Then she closed the door and stood in her kitchen for a moment in the quiet. 3 became none. 6 weeks later, the first hard frost came early that year, mid-October. It came overnight, the way frosts do in that country. Not announced, not preceded by any visible preparation from the sky, just arrived by morning, the way facts arrive. The garden took it. The last of the tomatoes went soft overnight. She pulled them before noon and made what could be made of them. The grand jury convened on October 8th, 5 days after the affidavit was formally logged with the territorial court. She knew this because Aldous Trent had written to her 3 sentences to confirm it. She read the 3 sentences. Set the letter beside Callum's notebook on the table. did not write anything in her working notebook that day. Just let the day be what it was. Forrest Lund was subpoenaed on October 19th. She learned this 11 days later from a copy of the Santa Fe Weekly Gazette that Hattie Greer at the post office had held specifically for her. The article was short, one column. It named Lund, named the investigation, mentioned that the investigation concerned land fraud, and that several witnesses had been identified, and that proceedings were expected to continue through the winter. It did not name her. It did not name Callum. It did not name anyone she needed to protect. She read it once, folded it, set it in the bottom drawer of the table, under 3 years of other papers, and closed the drawer. Briggs Malone was escorted to Santa Fe on September 21st by Deputy Marshal Fowler out of Cimarron. She had sent a message to Skimmeron the day after Malone walked into the gathering in the road. Fowler arrived on the 21st. Malone went without incident. She stood at the window when they rode past her house. Fowler in the lead. Malone behind on the gray roan, sitting the same way he always sat. Slightly upright, slightly careful, the posture of a man who had learned that the body communicates things the voice does not. He did not look at the house as he passed. She did not expect him to. She had said what needed to be said. So had Callum in his way. And the rest of it. Whatever happened in whatever room in Santa Fe, where Malone was eventually asked to account for himself, that was between him and the people whose function it was to hear it. She watched until the road was empty. Chet Quarles did not leave. The 3 men had arrived and 2 of them had departed and the third one had simply stayed. Not at the Copper Nail after the first week. He moved into the loft above the livery stable, which was dry and private and cost very little, and he began helping at the livery in exchange for the space. He was, it turned out, very good with horses. He did not talk about why he stayed. She did not ask. She saw him twice a week, on her town days. He would be doing whatever he was doing, mucking out a stall, working a saddle, walking a horse with a bad shoe, and he would see her passing and he would nod. She would nod back, that was all, except once. 3 weeks after September 14th, she was on her way back from the post office, and he was outside the livery tempering iron at a portable fire, and he said, without looking up, "Do you need anything today, Mrs. Drum?" She considered. "I could use help with the east fence. The posts went soft over the summer. I'll come by Thursday." He came by Thursday. He fixed the fence. He did not stay for coffee. He went back to the livery. The following week he fixed the south gate, which she had not mentioned. He simply noticed it needed doing and did it. Small things. November came. The territory got colder. She kept the garden in as long as she could. Pulled it finally in the second week of November, when the ground was beginning to freeze at the surface, and there was no longer any point in arguing with it. She stood in the empty garden after the last of it was cleared, looked at the turned-over soil. Not loss, not grief. Something more neutral than either. The plain fact of things having run their course. The undecorated evidence that time had passed and the season had changed, and next year's growing would have to wait for next year. She stood there for a while. Then she went inside. On the last day of November, she made coffee and sat at her table with Callum's notebook and the letter from Trent and the copy of the Santa Fe Weekly Gazette. All of it arranged before her. She did not open any of them. She just sat. She thought about what it meant to finish a crossing. Not the arriving, the finishing. That specific quality of the moment when you come down off the last elevation and the trail opens out and the terrain ahead of you is no longer the terrain that required all of your attention. You did not celebrate, not the good scouts, not the ones who lasted. You looked back once. You looked at what you had come through. You took a breath, and then you turned forward, because there was always something next. That was the only guarantee the world ever made. She picked up her coffee. She heard someone on the road outside. The particular rhythm of footsteps she recognized by now, the slightly uneven gait of a man with a healed injury in the right hip that only showed in his pace when he was tired or when the temperature had been dropping overnight. Quarles. She got up, went to the door, opened it before he reached it. He stopped, looked at her. He was carrying a bag of nails and a hammer. Of course he was. "Coffee's ready," she said. He looked at the hammer, at the nails. Back at her. "Gate can wait," she said. He came in. She poured him a cup. He sat down across from where she sat. in the chair that had been the empty fourth chair since the day Callum died. He wrapped his hands around the cup. She sat back down. They were quiet for a moment. The good kind of quiet. The kind that has something in it, rather than nothing. Then the little girl from the house, up the road, came running across the dirt with her brebies flying, and her boots crunching on the frost-hard ground. And she banged on the open door with both hands the way children bang on things, when they have decided the barrier between themselves and what they want is more formality than physics. She said, "Mrs. Drum, were you scared of those men that came in September?" Quarles did not move, but something in him paid attention. Nora looked at the girl. "Come here," she said. The girl came to the doorway, stopped there, looking at her with the full undivided interest that children bring to the questions they actually mean. "When I was your age." "How old are you?" "9. When I was 9 years old," she said, "I was afraid of the dark. I was afraid of the creek behind our house in flood season. I was afraid of the sound the wind made in the gap between our house and the barn on winter nights." She paused. "I was afraid of a great many things," the girl said, "but not now. Now I know those things," she said. "The dark, the creek, the wind. I know what they do. I know where they go. I know how to move through them." She looked at the girl steadily. "The men who came in September, I've been studying them for 3 years before they arrived. I knew where they came from. I knew why they were coming. I knew what every road out of this town looked like in September, and what every road out of this town would cost a man who tried to take it without local knowledge." She paused. "You don't fear the trail you have already walked?" The girl thought about this with the serious expression of a child deciding whether an answer is satisfactory or whether it has left something important unaddressed. Then she said, "What if you haven't walked it yet?" Nora looked at her. "A very good question. A better question than most adults asked," she said. "Then you walk slowly, and you pay attention. And you remember everything." The girl turned this over, tested the weight of it, seemed to find it sufficient. She ran back across the road, braids flying, boots crunching on the frost, in the direction of wherever children run when they have gotten what they came for, and the rest of the morning is still open and entirely theirs. Nora turned back to the table. Quarles was looking at his coffee. She looked at hers outside. The November sky above the messes was the color of old iron going cold, clear and clean and without a single cloud from one edge of the world to the other. The kind of sky that made the world look exactly as large as it was. She picked up her cup. She thought, "Callum, I'm here." It held. And the next part is still to come, and I am not afraid of it. She drank her coffee. Across the table, the young man with the watchful eyes was doing the same. Neither of them needed to say anything. The fire in the hearth made its small sounds. The frost held on the garden outside. The road to the west was empty, and the morning continued, which was, in its own quiet and unhurried way, the whole point of everything that had come before it. The whole point, and enough.